All right, folks, welcome back to Exodus. I have to say, I'm excited today because our chapter 4 of Exodus has one of the weirdest stories in the Bible. And I'm kind of excited to talk about why it's so weird.
It is good.
But before we get to both the continuation of Moses's conversation with God and then the very weird story before the story continues, I wanted to check in with you all. We didn't get as much discussion time after we talked about the name of God last week. And I wanted to check back in with you all if once again anything had settled, if you wanted to, any questions had come up or any thoughts in the passing week about the entirety of the conversation with God, but also specifically God's title and kind of that whole hoopla that we ran through. So any lingering thoughts from last week?
It was difficult. I reread it just to make sure I got it. And I read the bottom notes. I have the new Oxford Annotated Bible, which is pretty good on the bottom. And there's wide W Whitting, where there's 4 letters, and they're like 4 different names for God, and explained all this different stuff, which is pretty interesting. But God is really chatty in both chapters. I mean, he's got to give them all sorts of directions. I just was saying God wasn't walking around in the garden with people anymore. He started doing it again.
Yeah, that's a fun observation, Sue, of we've gotten snippets from God, but we haven't quite gotten this chapters long monologue from God until now, where God's it's almost like, God, are you lonely? Are you bored?
Yes.
You seem like you need a discussion partner here.
Yeah. And Moses is having a hard time understanding it too. But I don't know what he's talking about in this current chapter. So
okay.
I read it 5 times and I still didn't get it.
All right. So we'll walk through this part of the discussion. Any other thoughts from last week?
Well, I just never had thought about the name of God, so I thought it was very refreshing and interesting to look at the concept that has multiple names, because you don't want to have a specific name because you could use it in vain, and I thought that was refreshing. And that maybe that had been presented to me many times during the decades, but I never caught it.
Okay.
But people never, some people say, "Oh, Lordy," something like that sometimes.
Lordy Lord.
Yes.
I have to say, I don't know if it's worth doing a full sermon series, but there's been a thought jangling around in my head that it's should we have a discussion on the titles and terms that in Christianity we use to reference God? Because it's fascinating to me of how some of these terms work and how I think it's called a fossilized word, which means it's a word that we keep using even though the context falls away. Because it's purely fascinating to me that we call God Lord often, we call Jesus Lord, but we don't in our culture have lords and ladies. And so the idea of having a lord over the land is just not something we use. And it's there's a lot of kingship terms for God, but we don't have kings and queens. All of these terms were developed when there were actual kings, queens, and lords. So maybe one day I'll find a place to slot that in, because we use a lot of archaic terms for God that we just don't use commonly, which is fascinating.
But we have a strong tie to England, which has all of that.
Right. Yeah. At any rate, let's keep moving. So last chapter, after the whole God giving a name and a title, God lays out the plan of what's about to happen. I want you to go to Egypt. We're going to bring out the people, and we're going to go to the land of milk and honey. And so today, it starts off with Moses's objections. And kind of like we've already mentioned, Abraham was a get up and go guy. God said, go. Abraham went. Isaac didn't make any fuss. He just was like, okay, dad did it. I'm going to do it. Jacob was the bargainer. He's like, okay, you're going to do this for me. I'm going to do this for you. But there's no hesitation. And Joseph was kind of thrown into a situation whether he wanted it or not. Mm-hmm. Moses is not so keen on the idea. And this is where we see that he does not want to do this. And so before we get into his actual objections, we know that he does not think that this is what his ideal version of his life is. He is a reluctant leader. But I'm curious of what you all think about this kind of just in the abstract of someone who is kind of being thrust into this position, but doesn't really want to, who has their objections, who would rather not. What do you think of this kind of Moses pushing back when literally the creator of the universe is telling him to do something? What do you all think?
He had a lot of nerve. I mean, it seems like that would be very difficult to do, but it didn't seem hard for him. He was all ready to push back, but how can he have the nerve?
Yeah, well, he brought up. He was brought up. He wasn't brought up in the Jewish faith. He was brought up in the Pharaoh's household, so he may not have been quite as intimidated. I hadn't really thought about that. That's it. He also had a stammer, so he was self-conscious. Mm-hmm. He sounds like he didn't feel worthy. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he wanted to just do his life. But I don't know what made him so courageous. He may not have been as familiar, or may not have been familiar with Jewish culture. He also was brought up even in Egypt. All of it wasn't the same as being brought up in Israel. So I don't know. I hadn't really thought about why he was so reluctant, because there's so many reluctant later on, so many reluctant.
So we'll get to his objections one by one in a moment. So, Larry, what was your thinking?
Well, I was going to say he almost had an imposter complex from the get-go.
That's interesting.
I'm not what anybody thinks I am.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it. I think, or the term we often use today is imposter syndrome. When you're in a position and you're like, I have fooled everyone. No one knows that I'm not qualified for the position I have. And what I find fascinating in reading articles about this is often the people who have imposter syndrome are actually the ones who are qualified and who are actually right for the role. And it's the people who don't feel imposter syndrome that are often overconfident and believe they are qualified when they're sometimes not. That almost feeling imposter syndrome is a sign that you are the right choice because you're aware of your own deficits. Because being aware of your own deficits is not a bad thing. That actually makes it so you know where you need help. Moses is definitely aware of his deficits.
Yes.
So, any other thoughts of, generally speaking, why he might be hesitant to take on this role? Yeah,
Well,
I'm back to his uprising. And he knew his entire childhood that he wasn't Egyptian. Even though he was, raised, and this again, I'm going back to the movie, he was raised as a brother in the household, had status, fully Egyptian clothing, hairstyle, whatever. But in his heart, he knew that that was not his true identity. And then he kills an Egyptian and he runs. And so then he gets to the well, the famous, well repeating syndrome thing. And he's Egyptian looking, and yet now he knows he's really Hebrew. And so he's approaching the father with permission to marry his daughter, looking like a fully Egyptian, but knowing he's not, that he's Hebrew. So his whole past has been imposter. So now here he's playing the role again. And he's finally standing up for himself, saying, hey, leadership is not my role. This is not who I am. I'm standing, and I'm telling you, this is not who I am. I'm not a leader. I have a stutter. I'm a slow thinker. And he's finally owning, his reality.
Yeah, there's a bit of honest, like, I like how you painted that, Mary Ellen, of like, he's often been in situations where he's like slightly an outsider. He's incognito. He's like, even if he is accepted in the system, he kind of knows he doesn't fully belong. Almost like constantly wearing clothes that are either 2 sizes too small or 2 sizes too big. And like, you can close them, but it doesn't feel right. And now this is almost the time where I almost wonder if he like kind of got more comfortable as he's like living this life as a shepherd and kind of like finding out who he is with like a little less expectations of like palace and palace etiquette, that he's like, is he coming into himself and finally like, wait, I think I know myself now, and you're asking me a step too far.
Right.
It was like he was just get his arms around his own situation when the bush burst into flame. Like he was, no, he needed more time. He wasn't ready to take on these new challenges and go a new direction.
Yeah. Ooh. So one other thought added to this whole situation, where I think about there's a quote I love from Lord of the Rings. I've written Northminster notes about it, I think more than once, just because I think it's an interesting thought of like how to conceptualize our place in time. And it's a moment where Frodo, the guy who has the big task to carry the ring and destroy it, is talking to the old wizard who has declined to do that. And he makes the comment, I wish it never came to me. Because it's this big task and this big responsibility for just an average Joe, someone who has planned on living an average life, who never anticipated leaving his hometown, and all of a sudden he is responsible for trekking across the known world as he knew it to defeat ultimate evil. He doesn't exactly want to do it. And the old wizard says, well, no one in the time and place ever wants to do this. Like, it's never expected. But when it comes to your doorstep, basically you have to do it. And I wonder if there's a point where Moses he just didn't want to. What he was being asked to do was going to make his life complicated. It was going to be very stressful. It was going to be dangerous. And if he said no, he would have a quiet life as a shepherd. That like, it is. What?
Wait, no, he wasn't in slavery. He had left. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Oh, right. So it's one of those, he could ignore the problems of the world and his life could be good. His life would be good if he shut out the noise from the people he left. He had left the bad situation. Now God's asking him to go back in.
Go back in and take everybody with him.
And so there's a sense that I almost don't blame him. If you have found a good life, despite everything, do you really want to go back in?
Yeah.
So with some of these with all this kind of like what's going on in Moses's mind, let's actually see how he objects to God. So the first one is, why would people believe me? Like, and I think this comes from a very real place, because remember what the Egyptian or what the Hebrew person said to him when he tried to break up an argument. He's like, guys, don't fight with each other. And their response is, are you Lord over us? Are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? He's already had this one experience of being rejected by his people as a leader or authority figure. I think this objection is completely valid, of like, hey, they didn't accept me back then. Why are they going to accept me now?
Except his message is to lead them to freedom.
Say
You
more.
know?
What's the
Mhm.
difference?
Well, before, it didn't improve the lot of the Hebrew people that when he killed the Egyptian, yes, he saved the one Hebrew who was being beaten, but that was a one-time, one-off thing. Now he's coming back with a message of hope, of something that would affect the masses of the Hebrews. And yes, to me, there would be a lot of disbelief in the beginning, saying, you know, yeah, right, who are you? You're the guy who was the Egyptian, who was the Hebrew, who married this, and, you know, all these multiple roles. Why should you become a leader, you with the stutter and whatever? But yet he's coming back fortified, and with a message that he did not have before. He had actions before, but not a message. And so, you know, it's different this time.
Okay. I like that. Yeah. Any other thoughts? So God's response to this objection of like, why would they see me as an authority figure? Why would they believe me? So God gives Moses 3 signs. And it's like, if they don't believe your words, we're going to give you a little bit of miracle power. The first one is one that I know the 10 Commandments movie spent a lot of special effects money on, of turning the staff into a snake and back into a staff. Second one is put the hand into the cloak, pull it out, and you're going to be leprous. I find it funny, once again, thinking of the difference between using European actors and people who are from the Middle East, because if you turned my arm white as snow, it's not going to turn a very different color. But if you have more pigmented skin, actually turning white would be a big contrast. And so stick your hand in the cloak, it's going to be sick and white. Stick it back in and it's going to come back. It's going to look normal again. And then the third one is throw some water on dry ground and it will turn into blood. So what do you think of these 3 kind of, I'm hesitant to call them magic tricks, but they're kind of those like signs and wonders, small signs and small wonders. These aren't the big ones yet. These are just small. Would they convince you all if you saw them?
Yeah.
I wouldn't necessarily think he was a leader, you know, just so he could do magic tricks. So,
Well,
I don't even, you know, it's something I don't remember this at all from this. This doesn't seem to be the to me until I read it. I thought, oh, I don't remember this being part of the story.
Well, the question, so that's actually, Sue, hold on to that, because there's some time spent explaining these things. I don't think these make it into the animated movie. I know for a fact they do make it into the Charleston Heston version.
They do.
But the question is, how do these tricks eventually get used? So hold in your brains we'll get to it at the end of the hour, but remember that these are meant to convince the Hebrew people. These are meant to convince his own people that he's an authority figure.
Right, that he's set by God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So hold on to that thought. So one of my notes, as I was reading up a little bit more of some of what the scholars think, they indicated that these 3 signs might be a foreshadowing of different plagues. And so I'm curious, thinking forward, because I think we know some of the 10 plagues just off the top of our heads. What could these different signs foreshadow? So thinking about snakes, there's not a plague of snakes. Is there a close one for one of the plagues?
The frogs?
Yeah. So that's one. The leprous hand might be foreshadowing. There's the plague of boils that gets on people's skin. And then take water, throw it on the ground, turn it to blood.
The Nile?
Yeah. So that's actually the first plague, is turning the Nile red.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so these 3 might be foreshadowing for the plagues, maybe. But like I said, these are actually meant to convince the Hebrew people.
I don't think it was enough.
No?
Yes, it was dramatic, but it wasn't dramatic enough. If instead of turning the staff into a snake and back, which, people could say it's a trick, somehow he's got a trick going, but if he'd provided 1,000 frogs, that would be a little more dramatic to get their attention. I don't think he had enough to work with to really get their attention.
Okay.
Well, it's interesting, the stuff that he was going to do isn't really violent, but the stuff they did to Egypt was really violent.
So that's another interesting point, is these initial 3 signs meant to convince the Hebrew people, they're just visual. They're not inflicting harm. They're not really impacting people's lives. They're literally just signs and wonders meant to amaze and convince, but not coerce, almost, as some of the later ones will.
They're sort of credentials.
So this is the resume.
It gives him some stature. He's just not another shepherd.
Mhm.
Whether it comes from some holy power or not, just makes somebody wonder, well, why this guy is special. We need to keep an eye and listen to him.
Yeah.
I would probably think he needed to be in a mental hospital.
But I think one other thing that, kind of stitching together some of your all's thoughts of, he kind of left as a fugitive. He had an attempt of leadership that didn't work out well. So as he comes back, it's like, what has changed? Oh, well, he must have had some divine encounter, because here's his resume that he has changed, that he isn't just a dude talking. He now has like some sort of power behind him, which is not the way he left. So it's almost a sign that something has changed, that yes, he has been in contact with God.
Yeah, he did run away, so he didn't appear to be a really courageous person.
Yeah. So the second objection is the one so the first one, definitely understandable. Why should people believe me? And this is a question that I definitely think that is important for leaders to think about. It's like when you're stepping into a leadership position, and it's like, what qualifies me? Why do I want this? Why am I being asked to do this? What am I bringing to the table? Good question to ask. second question, I think, is very human, but it's interesting to see the way it comes out. So his second objection is, "My lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor even that you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." So a little bit of commentary just about what some of this means. A lot of interpretations have said, like, yeah, like this is an implication of some speech impediment, which is the very traditional one of like slow of tongue is literally saying it's not behaving properly. So there's a thought of like, can he actually speak? Like, can he speak in a way that people understand? There are other thoughts that another few ways that people have looked at this is it may be implying that he is not good at speaking in multiple languages. That if he is going to the Egyptian court, maybe he actually isn't fully fluent in Egyptian. Or at least one scholar was saying this, that like maybe it's implying that like he's good, he can speak in Hebrew and he can speak in Egyptian, but he can't wax eloquently. It's not going to be like the tongue of Shakespeare as he's talking. He may be able to speak the language, but he doesn't want to be on the debate team. Like, I'm going to have to go to these people who are used to speaking in these verbose ways. I'm just like a common dude. I'm not good at speaking fancifully. So that's another thought, is he's actually just saying like, I'm just not good at the speaking thing. And then there's other people that it's like, he may have stage fright and just be like, I don't like public speaking. Not my jam, which I think a lot of people can relate with. Yeah, Mary Ellen, I see you trying to jump in.
Say that he's always played a secondary role.
Mhm.
And that's his comfort zone. And to ask him to come forward and, speak to the masses, whether it's the Hebrew or the Egyptians, and repetitively to the Hebrews, that's asking him to become a powerful, his whole self-image and self-concept needs to change to exude this power of the message. And he's just saying, hey, like you said, not my thing. I'm, the imposter. I'm the secondary guy. I don't want to be out front.
Mm-hmm.
But
And
where is his faith? It seems to me when God asks you to do something, you don't have an argument. You do it because God wants you to. And he's going to give you all the things you need to do it. I kind of can feel what Moses is feeling because I think I've sort of felt like that myself, but I never argued about it, but maybe I should have.
So not the same, but just an interesting thought experiment. So I will be honest, I love public speaking and I always have. So it's not something that I fully understand. But I know the paleness that goes on people's face when I even jokingly be like, hey, that sounds great. You should preach the sermon. And people do like the no, I don't want to preach.
Yeah.
Like I will be a liturgist, like you write up what I'm supposed to say and I can say, but do not make me preach. And that kind of reaction is almost what I'm seeing here. Moses being like, nope.
I was thinking about how many people are just the opposite. That
Oh,
they
yeah?
think
Say more.
overqualified. I mean, think of all the people who are jumping into the presidential race right now. I mean, some of them are just so unqualified. Where did they get the chutzpah to, and that's a Jewish word.
Yeah.
Moses did not have chutzpah. That's a Yiddish word. It's a Yiddish word. So they didn't have Yiddish.
So this is actually interesting thinking about it, like in our own world of like public speaking is a trained skill. So like however much like I love public speaking, I've also had training in like people critiquing me like trying to fine tune it, finding what works, finding what doesn't work. It is a skill. And there are some people who have very much trained their skill even more than I have. And then there's people who are speaking who have not had public speaking training or skills that maybe not be their gift, but they're doing it anyways. And I'm curious about the thought of when is a time for a good public speaker with training, and kind of what are our connotations with that, versus when we hear someone who is untrained, but kind of what are the connotations when you hear the difference between them. And sometimes it matters on venue, because frankly, I am very frustrated when I can tell that someone is giving I'm talking about my colleagues, not like people who have gone to seminary, and you have speech and preaching class. Like we have to have those classes, and I'm like, did you not take notes in preaching class? Like, this is bad. And it's almost like a sad thing when, like, seeing some of my colleagues that are brilliant people, that are great pastors, and boring, bad preachers. Like, there are just people whose gift is not preaching. And in, like, a church setting, I think that comes off differently than when you're in, like, when people are either on the news or on debate platforms who aren't quite as polished. And so I'm curious what your all's perception of is when you see someone in front of you who is a good public speaker versus someone who's like unpolished and untrained. Mary Ellen, I saw a hand.
Well, it can go, to me, it can go either way. And I'm going to take it out of the preaching realm and people who've had classes and should have paid attention. Sometimes your unpolished people are, their sincerity comes across. And I'm suspicious of speakers that are so highly polished, because to me, they can be like playing a role.
Yeah.
In a debate, they're preaching, or they're given the side of the debate they may not believe in, but by golly, they're going to win the debate and come up with all the reasons. It doesn't always, my theory doesn't always work, particularly like in politics and so on, because those people get dropped off along the way. But in personal relationships, unpolished speakers can often be the most sincere.
Okay.
Well, yeah, sometimes you're talking about finding people that seems polished, a little bit slick, and maybe not completely honest. Is that what it feels like, Mary Ellen? That they're just kind of slick without being deep? Is that what you're?
Yeah. Larry, do you have a thought?
Some of the most polished speakers are snake oil salesmen, But I was thinking the contrast I got, if you look at two qualified speakers, say President of the United States, and you listen to Obama give a speech, and then you listen to Biden or almost anybody else, and there's an obvious contrast. I mean, one of them is a very skilled orator, and the other just isn't. Now, that doesn't mean the message isn't worthy, but it makes the listening to it a different feeling. I cringe when I see people trying to give a talk and they just don't have the skills to do it.
Or confidence.
Yeah.
I think Moses could be concerned about that he didn't maybe have the confidence, and there is a very there's a concern when you're speaking that you could say things that are not what you mean, and you have that pressure that you're not doing a good job of getting your message across. And so it's not an enjoyable experience.
Mhm.
There is always the contrast of what do you mean? What are you meaning to say, and what do people hear? And those are not the same. And it's something that every public speaker has to contend with is your intention may be one thing, but you like if that isn't coming across, if you're not saying it in a way that people can hear, then people may be hearing something else. And the other reality is people always have feedback one way or the other. When you're putting yourself in front of people, you're going to hear people's responses. And so you kind of open yourself up. It's very vulnerable to speak, especially, I mean, I doubt he has a thing of notes that he can refer to. He doesn't have a definitely does not have like a paper manuscript or bullet points. He's going to be talking off the top of his head. And that is a vulnerable thing to do because you're inviting feedback and potentially criticism or pushback for what came out of your mouth. That's personal. So I think we can all say that, yeah, we sympathize with Moses being like, no, like the public speaking thing that's terrifying. Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, I'm gonna change the focus here a little bit. I'm thinking about God asking this of him and Moses saying, whoa, not me, I'm not qualified. It makes me think of times when I've been asked to do something and it's like, whoa, I'm not putting myself out there. Why are you asking me of all people? And it turns out because that person sees something in me I didn't know was there. Or a potential that I don't think about my potential, to be perfectly honest. And so when someone from outside is saying, but you could do this or you could grow into this particular position, I'm thinking that perhaps God was in that position where he saw potential in Moses, and he was looking at something that Moses was just not seeing and did not want to acknowledge. You know, I can relate to the situation personally.
Yeah. So that is part of why actually I was thinking about like how we perceive public speakers is because Moses being maybe not the most eloquent may actually be part of the potential God is seeing. Is like there's an authenticity that he may be bringing that he doesn't understand in himself. Or maybe it's something that he is not skilled at yet that he needs to grow into, but the building blocks are there. And yeah, I appreciate your thoughts, Mary Ellen, of like what it means for someone else to see a gift that you don't personally see. Because sometimes the gifts that we think we have are part of like our self-conception.
Right.
How do we conceive of ourselves? What do we think? And sometimes when someone brings something to the table, it's like, oh, I don't have a place to put this in how I understand myself. And it takes a little bit of time getting thinking or like adding that in. Yeah, Larry?
I was thinking when one is asked to do something, say, the response often is, I don't want, either I don't want to do it, I'm not qualified to do it, I don't have the skills and so forth. And one of the purposes of all of this might be to show the power of God. God is going to take this ordinary person, one of us that doesn't want to do these things. We're not out there volunteering. I'm going to go climb that mountain, and so forth. And yet God is now going to make him into that hero that really does things. And so what is it? It's not Moses, it's God pushing him.
And I think that is exactly what God's response basically says is, who gives speech to mortals, who makes them deaf, seen or blind? Is it not I? Like,
Me.
come on, Moses. This actually isn't about you. This is about me. I just need a vessel to talk through. Like, this isn't like, Moses is not bringing the people out of Egypt. I am bringing the people out of Egypt. Get with the program. You aren't doing this. I'm doing this.
But God certainly has plenty of self-confidence.
I am glad. I want a God with self-confidence. I will say that. If God, I am really glad that someone has a plan.
Well, that was sort of what I was trying to say before, but
Oh, yeah?
Larry said it more eloquently. But I said, where is his faith? And I think that, believing in God is the only thing that he had to think about.
Right. And I think that's an interesting takeaway for like us as well, is sometimes when we're asked to do things, we think about like us doing it. Like, I, Chris Hallam, have been asked to do this thing. Can I do this thing? I don't know. Can Larry do this thing on his own? Can Helen? Can Sue? Can like Gary and Joe? Can Mary Ellen? Can we do this personally? And like thinking about our own gifts and our own abilities, can I do this self-sufficiently without any help? And the answer is often no.
No.
This is one of the things that I was trying to make clear when we were talking about building the garden that is now built and launched, is choosing a project that Northminster could not do. We chose a project that was bigger than what our congregation can handle, and that was intentional, because that meant that we had to rely on other people. And so sometimes we need to look beyond ourselves for whether or not we can do amazing things, because it's not always just us. So Moses's final objection is, I don't want to. Send someone else. Probably the most honest answer he gives. Just please, God, no. So what do you think of the final response of, God, I just really don't want to do this, please?
God gets a little impatient.
Yeah.
Aaron into this, and
He gives a solution.
in verse 14, he's angry at Moses, but then he brings Aaron in and talks about all the skills that Aaron has. He can talk fluently. I don't get it.
What don't you get?
Well, God's been convincing Moses and has chosen Moses as his speaker, but then it looks to me like God is the one bringing Aaron into the mix.
Yeah.
And,
And that tells everybody who's running the show.
say more, Larry, I don't get that.
Well, God is running, God brings Aaron in to convince the readers, that whatever is going to happen is going to be God's doing. It's not going to be Moses's doing. Or Moses is just Aaron's just another worker in God's plan, just like Moses. Moses, all you're doing is carrying out my orders. Well, if you don't want to do all of it, we'll let Aaron do some of it too. So now you got two people out there speaking for me, but I'm still running the show.
And Moses is going to do the tricks.
Well, in verse 15, it says, you shall speak to him and put words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth. So they both are going to speak. It's not like he's putting him out into pasture. Aaron's going to do it all.
Well, Moses is going to speak to Aaron, and then Aaron's going to speak to the people.
Right, but he's still going to put the words in Moses's mouth, according to verse 15.
Yeah, it's somebody. God isn't going to speak to Aaron. God's just going to speak to Moses, and Moses has got to speak to Aaron, and Aaron's got to speak to the people.
So
Why didn't he just pick Aaron instead of putting Moses in all of this? I mean, I don't get the Aaron-Moses connection with God. And I mean, in history, Moses becomes everything. And Aaron kind of drops off to the wayside. But right now, Moses is objecting. And so God's angry at him and says, then fine, we'll take Aaron, who can do all these things, has all these skills. I'll teach both of you what to say. But I don't know. I don't get why Aaron comes into the mix.
So I have two thoughts about this. One is like in the notes that says that this is actually a physical example of what happens later on. So Moses is to Aaron as God is to the prophets later on. That it's actually mimicking something else that is a type that happens later on. So Moses has the word of God, Aaron is the voice box. Later on, God has the words and the prophet will be the voice box. And so it kind of is a prefiguring when you think of like Isaiah or Jeremiah, it's kind of how they will explain it is like, hey, we're this relationship just in a different time. Another way to look at it though is we can say no to God. There's some very traditional forms of like Reformed theology where it basically acts like we're little puppets and everything's preordained. God has the path set out and we're just kind of like puppets along the way going along, and God's already decided how things are gonna go. This is one that actually shows that we're active participants in God's plan. Which means that if we have the free will to say yes, we have the free will to say no. And here Moses is saying no. And God basically says, okay, my plan's still going to happen. You decided to choose a path that I would rather you have not chosen, but I'm still going ahead with my plan. You just have a lesser part now. And I think this can be something we can very much sink our teeth into, is sometimes we have a call to do something in our life and we can say no. We can choose to do things or not do things. We can choose to participate in some aspects of how the ministry looks. We can choose to not be a part of it. God's Spirit is still going to do what it's going to do. It's just whether or not we want to be in on the party or not. You can choose to not bring the kingdom of God to earth, but it doesn't mean the kingdom of God is not coming. It just means God's going to choose someone else. It means it's going to be somewhere else. It means it's going to look different because of our choices, but we're not strong enough to stop God's plan. And so sometimes it's when we're thinking about what our role in, and when we do feel called, it's the question of, do you want to participate in what's already happening? We're not going to stop it. We can't prevent it. I say again and again, we cannot kill the church. However much people want to write the eulogy and the obituary for the modern Christian church, we can't kill it. We're not strong enough. If it dies out where we are, it's just going to go somewhere else. And God is going to keep moving to people who want to participate. And so that is one of my biggest hopes, is we're not strong enough to stop God's plan. It's just whether we want to be participants in God's plan or not. So that's kind of where I see it, is Moses is still given agency. He's not completely cut out of it. God works with Moses. As we see, there's no other objections after this, but Moses is also like kind of downgraded for the moment because he didn't want to be.
Makes sense.
Is that a helpful way to look at it?
Yeah, and Moses isn't cut out. He's just said, this speaker role is not a position I'm comfortable with. He doesn't want to opt out. He just doesn't want that role that God chose for him.
And God works with that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
In the end, God may have been a little bit angry, but God still goes forward, and Moses is still in the plan.
Mhm.
So, after this whole conversation, no more complaints from Moses. He goes back to his father-in-law. If this sounds a little repetitive for a moment, it's likely because once again, this is where stories are stitched together. Moses says to Jethro, "Hey, I need to go back to Egypt. Let me go visit." The word kindred is that's a gender neutral term. It does say, "Let me go back to my brothers and see if they're still alive." And Jethro sends him on his way. Go in peace. And so we get this recommission of God. Either Moses is still hesitant, or this is a different tradition of how he gets to Egypt, where the Lord says to Moses, "Go back to Egypt, for all those who were seeking your life are dead." So this is once again a confirmation that Pharaoh, the old Pharaoh that was like knew of your deeds, he's gone. You're no longer a fugitive. No one remembers you. So Moses took his wife, his sons, put them on the back of the donkey, and they're traveling on the way to Egypt, and he has his staff in hand, his magical staff in hand. So once again, probably from a different tradition, we get kind of a rephrasing of what's going to happen, but there is some key details that we are very low on time. Let's see, because we spent a lot of time on the first part. Are you all okay staying like 5 or 10 minutes longer? I don't want to, or do people have things to go to afterwards?
No,
After
no.
this?
Fine.
I understand this, yeah.
Okay, we're gonna zoom through a little bit, and if you don't mind staying on a little longer. Okay. So, we get the rephrasing of what God's planning on doing. The interesting part that we're gonna have to continue to wrestle with. So, I want this to be in your head, but this phrase is gonna come up a few times, so we're gonna have this conversation another day, all right? Is God says, "I will harden Pharaoh's heart."
Mhm.
There is a question of whether Pharaoh is stubborn in doing this himself, or whether God is causing Pharaoh to be stubborn. And here, God is taking responsibility for Pharaoh's stubbornness. God is going to be the one hardening his heart. And we're going to grapple with what that means in a little bit to come, because when the plagues come, it will say, "This happened and God hardened his heart." So this is going to be a repeating phrase. We just don't have time to wrestle with this today.
Yeah,
So you all take note and put a pin in it.
that's not the weird part.
No, the weird part is the next section. Well, actually, other thing that just prefigures what's to come before we get to the weird section. Verse 23, we have a little bit of prophesying that Moses is supposed to do, and it says, "Israel is my firstborn son. Because you held my firstborn son captive, I'm going to take your firstborn son." That is a threat.
So whose firstborn son is he talking about? Or who he was?
This one is supposed to be said to Pharaoh. So this is prefiguring the last plague where the firstborn sons die. This is once again a foreshadowing of that. We get it already that God has a plan, and it is going to end in the 10th plague. This is already set into motion.
So he's going to kill Pharaoh's firstborn son?
Yes.
Yeah. And who does Israel refer to?
Israel at this point refers to the people.
The nation, the
Yeah.
people.
Yeah, it's basically referring to the covenant that was of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob/Israel. This is where Israel starts to refer to the entire people of the covenant. So
Okay.
this covenanted people, they're not God's only children. It's just considered the firstborn,
It's
Mm.
which is this kind of elect status.
Oh,
So that's a prefiguring, and then we get this wild story that's only like 2 or 3 verses long. So this is what I want to hold you a little bit longer for. The context I will give you is scholars do not know where or what this story means. One of the confusing things is the pronouns are entirely ambiguous. We don't actually know who it's talking about.
yeah.
And there seems to be some cultural connotations that have just been lost to history. So we have this wild story that Moses and his wife are on the road and sons in tow. So previously when he leaves, it uses sons plural. At this point, we only know of one son. At any rate, they are on the road. And just for no reason at all, God decides to attack him. Who him is, we don't know if it's Moses or Moses' son, but there is an attempt at one of their lives on the way to Egypt. So Zipporah is the daughter of a priest. So this is where very much she knows the ritual practices. Jethro would have been the one to have performed these things. And so she takes a flint, literally like a sharp rock that was used in this ceremony, and circumcises either her son or Moses. Unclear which one she does.
Oh, really?
And this is also, once again, where a euphemism is likely being used, that she does the deed, and it says she cuts off her son's foreskin. So she does circumcise her son, and she touches it to Moses's feet. Feet is often a stand-in word to mean the nether regions of a man. So we don't know if this is actually his foot or his area.
Yeah.
And she makes the comment of, truly you are a bridegroom of blood to me. We don't know what this phrase means. There is some thought that a bridegroom meant a circumcised male who is ready for marriage. And God, after his son is circumcised, God lets him alone. Once again, we don't know who him is. There's also, actually backing up, touches his feet. So the translators of the Bible often say touched Moses's feet. There's actually another pronoun. We don't fully know whose feet were touched with this foreskin, but she claims that he is a bridegroom of blood by circumcision, which seems to be a cultural phrase, which once again, we don't know what that means.
Yeah.
So in summary, God attacks Moses' family on the road. Zipporah jumps into action, circumcises someone, touches the foreskin to someone, and then God says, okay, I'll not attack you.
Is it possible that Moses wasn't circumcised?
No.
There
No.
is a possibility.
Why? The Jews circumcised people on the 8th day. Moses wasn't put in the basket and floated down the river till well after he was 8 days old.
Yeah.
Right. So that is why it's assumed to be Moses' son that gets circumcised, is
Yeah.
because Moses was likely circumcised himself. But then again, Jethro is a priest of Midian who evidently circumcises enough people that Zipporah knows how to do it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I
So-
wouldn't doubt her skill.
It's not typical, mind you, it's actually not typically the woman who does it. She's just she just goes for it. Mary Ellen, I see a comment with you.
Go on, pass
Okay.
me.
Wild story. Like I said, we don't actually have record of who's who in this story. The one commentary that has a slight explanation is that this also shows they connect it to the threat that was just above of, I am going to kill your firstborn son. And what we see in the 10th plague is the sacrifice of lambs with the blood upon the door, and that blood seems to protect from God's divine wrath. And here, the thought of what may be happening is that Moses' son is getting protected from God's divine wrath by circumcision in this one moment. So it's almost like a prefiguring of he's gonna be safe from God's wrath. And there is a protective, blood is somehow protective against this. Maybe, but it seems to be a story that was maintained, but that the context was somehow lost. That it was in some story version of the story that likely had more explanation, but it was just stitched in here. So any other thoughts on one of the weirder stories in the Bible of this like emergency circumcision, for lack of a better term?
Yeah. It just seems so incongruous
Yeah,
to have this sort of stuck in there. Almost like the verse was cut open and this was stuck in, you know.
And the threat to kill Moses or to kill Moses' son. I mean, it's just strange.
Right. Like
After-
God has just like commissioned him and said like I like has made so many capitulations to Moses's qualms, and all of a sudden God is like attacking him. It's like what? Wild.
Or you could be testing his devotion.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So nobody has come up with all those commentaries. Nobody has a really good idea what it means. No.
Nope.
And according to the narrative, Moses is completely unaware, I gather, of what's going on. I mean, at least there's no indication that he played any part in any of this at all,
Yeah,
other than being passive.
Right.
it's one took care of it. Yeah.
So one other interesting just note, just going forward, this is the last time Zipporah and Moses' family will be mentioned until after the Exodus. So after the Exodus, there is a reunion, but for some reason, Zipporah doesn't seem to stick around, and we don't have any explanation. This is like this one family moment, and then they're going to disappear from the story for a while. So there is some thought that after this, she may have turned around and went back to dad while Moses dealt with stuff in Egypt. We don't know.
Or Moses moved on without her.
Yeah. Yeah. So this isn't the last time we'll see them, but it is just a weird story. And Larry, you're pretty much right. It does feel like the story got broken open. This part just got dropped in, which is likely actually what happened.
But it does give some statue to Zipporah, because she sprung into action as the wife of Moses, and yet we don't understand all the things, but it brought her into the picture again with some degree of skill and backbone.
Right. She is one of the few named women of the Bible, and I love Zipporah, if only because she doesn't ask for permission. She like does what she needs to do, and she has this like very like assertive nature to her that it comes across in this story. And it's nice to have a named woman in the Bible. So I always love to point them out when we have names for women. And so Moses's wife seems to be a boss babe who may be more in control than Moses is the thing. Like she definitely like she does what she has to do, and I love her for it. Anyways, with 2 minutes to go, thank you all for staying a little bit longer. Just to sum up the last few verses. So Aaron comes out to meet Moses. They meet at the mountain of God, which is where the burning bush was. That references Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, same place. Moses tells Aaron they seem to know each other already, which is where some of the movies have fleshed this out a little bit of how do these two already seem to be on speaking terms. They greet each other with a kiss, which shows a level of familiarity.
They're brothers.
Right. But we haven't seen Aaron in the story before. So it's like,
I
yes,
see.
they're brothers, but how do they know each other? That's the question. And
Hmm.
so there's a little bit of imagination that
I
has
see, yeah.
gone on in the movie scripts. Mary Ellen?
Well, this brother would have been the son of his mother. And there was a time a few chapters back or whatever where searching for his mother was a very big deal, and perhaps got to know his half siblings or his full siblings. You know, at that time, he knew who Aaron was. Perhaps, you know,
This is
whatever.
one of the questions where, yeah, there's a lot of perhapses and a lot of gaps to fill in because it's, I mean, this goes back to the question of like when Moses was being taken care of as a baby, how long was he in that household? We don't know, but there does seem to be some familiarity here. So Moses and Aaron, they go to the elders of Israel, and Aaron is acting as voice box. He says the words that the Lord spoke to Moses. So Moses is telling Aaron, Aaron is telling the elders, Aaron performs the signs, and the people believe and they bow down and worship. No issue here. Moses was expecting rejection and they have acceptance off the bat.
Mm-hmm.
So, since I've held you over, we're going to wrap up for today. If you, we can touch on that ending of like that kind of transition next time and kind of think about Moses's worries and did they come into fruition and what's going forward of how this situation's taking shape. What's actually going to happen as the story really starts ramping up. So, with that, let us pray. Gracious God, there's a lot of times you ask us to do things and we are not prepared. Just as Moses was hesitant, just as he would have rathered someone else do these things, as he thought of himself as not strong enough, not able enough, not well trained enough, you chose him anyways, and even in his fears and his doubts, you worked with him. And that's what we ask of you always, is that you call us into the world to further your message of love, of peace, of justice. And that often means that we have to do things that aren't in our comfort zone, things that we would never imagine ourselves doing, things that we wish we had the boldness enough to do it, or the confidence, or the skills. And so we ask that you be present in our life so we may be so bold as to be able to say yes to your calling, that we might find confidence and skills along the way, that we might hold each other up when we see another person who is feeling timid and afraid, that we may be like Aaron to each other, that we may be like Moses who learns to do amazing things along the way, that we may be your people, that we may live into the calling of being your firstborn leaders onto our communities, people who are willing to hear the cries of others and be bold enough to speak out when you call us to. So God, forever be the words on our lips and the love in our hearts that overflow always. So we pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right.
Thank you.
Chris,
Thank you, Ann.
Thank you so much for sticking around a little after. See you all next week.
hey,
All right. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.